Hi, this is Tim Lightfellow again. Video is to demonstrate dying arrow shafts. This would be the step after you taper your shafts. You can do this in several ways. First off, if you're doing like what they refer to as a back or a crown dip on an arrow, what I would normally do is figure out how long I want that, measure it, put a pencil mark around the shaft there. That tells me how much to put dye on and where to stop. The dye I use is leather dye. It tends to kind of creep along the wood grain. So I will actually, when I'm doing it, stop short of the line and see how far it goes. And then go back in and kind of touch up spots to try and get as close to a line as possible. One other way I've learned that you can do that, I had some shafts that I was doing a red front and a black back. And so what I did is just put a really narrow strip of white paint, and it kept the colors from bleeding across and mixing with each other. Master Godric does this with stains and tape rather than marking and using leather dye. There are other ways out there to do it as well, I'm sure. Another thing about crown dip is you really can't get, the way I do it with leather dye, you can't get white leather dye. And yellow leather dye is not going to give a very good coat. So typically for whites or yellows, I'll go with a latex paint. And at that point, a lot of times, if you buy what they call the little dipper, you can fill it with paint, and then you can dip the shafts into that and then pull them out, let them drip dry, and then hang them over something that you don't mind that dripping on to let them finish drying. Otherwise, for reds, blues, blacks, greens, I tend to use Fiebing's leather dyes. The one I'm going to demonstrate right now is called Fiebing's Low VOC Red. And in this case, I'm doing crossbow bolts, which the whole shaft is going to be red. So I have not had to pre-measure and mark these as far as where to stop the dye at. Now, I keep my daubers in Ziploc bags. So I have one for black paint, I have one for the blue paint, I have one for the red. Sorry, I keep saying paint. The leather dye. One for the green I don't appear to. So what I do for this is I will put the dauber in, and then I'll kind of press it against the sides to help keep it from having so much that it drips. And then I will grab the first shaft, and I do this one of a couple ways. On these, since I'm doing the whole shaft, I'll usually start up near the tip. I'm holding the tapered end, by the way, so because I want all the back dipped, colored. I don't want color where the tip is going to be necessarily. With this leather dye, it doesn't seem to impact the ability of the glue to stick, so I'm not super worried about it, but I try not to get past that tip because I mean, at that point you're just wasting your leather dye in the first place. Now, the other thing I do with bolts is I try and make sure the back end is actually covered. And then I'm going to set it down and grab the next one. And I can usually, depending on the wood, get 2 or 3 done for each time that I have to cover. This being hickory, it takes the dye a little bit differently. And so you may notice I check and I kind of go back over some areas because it is not on quite as smoothly as it typically does on other woods. So I'm trying to make sure that I've actually covered all the spots. It's a little hard in here. You may notice this is not where I normally shoot videos. I happen to be working out in my shed right now because the low VOC dye that I'm using tends to be a little bit extra smelly. And while I can generally handle some of it, my family can't. So I'm out here. Once you've done your dye on these, from what I've experienced, I let the dye dry for about 24 hours. Excuse me. And then what I will do, these will get likely, we'll see what the red looks like after one coat, but they will likely get a second coat. And so in between coats, or if I only do one coat in between doing the coat and doing sealant, I will wipe this down with paper towels to get the excess dye off, because the one thing we have seen over and over is that if you don't wipe much of the dye off, you end up with dye all over in your sealant, and that can cause issues with putting the sealant on. So I will finish a couple more of these just so you can kind of see the process, and just kind of do it the same way on all of them. I have 14 to do. 12 of these are going to someone. So I actually, after I do this, and then after I do the 2 coats and then do sealant, then I will measure them and find the 12 closest matched, and those are the ones that will go to the person. Okay, so this would be the same process for a back dip or crown dip. Again, if you're unfamiliar with those terms, that usually means where just like the back end is colored rather than the whole shaft. And one trick I've found for getting that that line is if you just carefully put this down and spin, you can control that edge with the dye better, and so it should give you a cleaner cleaner line at the end of the coloring. The next step after doing this would be dipping. I don't know if I'll be able to demonstrate that when I get to that point, so I'll kind of explain the process. What I use is an oil-based dip. It is called Daly's Pro-Fin. I prefer the gloss because it tends to really brighten up the colors that I'm using on the shafts. And what I do is I use a product that's available online called the Big Dipper dip tube, and I fill that with the Daly's Pro-Fin, and then I'll take, as an example, I would take the shaft once it's dyed and dry. I'll hold it by the tip. I will dip it into up to basically the crown of where the taper is, and then I'll pull it out. I'll let it drip, the excess drip back into the dip tube for a while, and then I will swing it over and hang it right below me. You can't see this on the camera, but I have a dip station I've set up here that has a rope that's tight across. It has some of these plastic clips, which are great for going around the rope and clipping onto the tip, the tapered tip of the shaft. And so those hold it over a plastic container that lets it just drip off, and so that it doesn't. When I do the dipping, again, the dip tends to take about 24 hours to dry. After this, I would do 2 coats. If I'm doing cresting, that's when I would do that, which I've done a video on already. And then after that, I do at least 1 more coat of sealant, because otherwise the cresting will just wear off as you're putting the bolt or arrow into targets. And then from there, the next step would be fletching, which I'm going to be doing a separate video on. Thank you for watching and have a good day. Yes.